October 3, 1942, 3 a.m. The radio operator at Arlington Signal Station checks his watch for the 50th time that night. His name is David Patterson, and he should be sleeping. Instead, he sits in a small wooden hut that does not appear on any official map, listening to German military radio transmissions. The hut is warm despite the autumn chill outside. Coffee sits cold in a cup beside him. He is thinking about his sister. She works in a shipping office in New York. 3 weeks ago, her company hired 20 new cargo ships to run supplies across the Atlantic to England. David does not know which ships. He does not know when his sister will see him next. He only knows that somewhere out there, in the middle of the ocean, German submarines are hunting. At 3 minutes and 47 seconds past 3 a.m., a German voice comes through David's headphones. It is speaking in code, a simple 3-letter substitution cipher that the American code breakers have been studying for months. The voice is calm and professional. The man on the other end is reporting a position. 14 degrees west latitude, 52 degrees north longitude. U-boat identification number 5053. Commander Ernst Emmermann. David recognizes the voice immediately. He has heard it 5 times before. The same voice, the same pattern. Always the Atlantic, always a position report, always coded but predictable. David removes his headphones and walks down the narrow hallway to the office next door. The hallway smells like cigarettes and old coffee. The door is marked Intelligence Analysis Section. Inside, Margaret Chen sits at a desk covered with maps and intercept transcripts. Margaret is the most intelligent person David has ever met and the least impressed by her own intelligence. She speaks 8 languages. Her memory works like a recording device. She can hear a voice once and identify it 6 months later. But intelligence is not about talent. It is about patterns. And patterns are beginning to emerge. Margaret looks up from her papers. She is tired. She has been at this desk since 7 a.m. the previous morning. A strand of hair has come loose from her braid. There is a small photograph next to her desk. A young man in a naval uniform standing in front of a cargo ship. Her brother Thomas. He serves as a merchant marine captain. He runs convoys across the Atlantic. Last month, his ship was attacked by a German U-boat. His ship survived. 12 merchant ships in his convoy did not. 478 men died. Margaret was in this office when the casualty reports came through. She did not cry. She did not leave her desk. She simply looked at the photograph of her brother and kept working. David says, "I just intercepted Emmermann again. Position report coded in the standard substitution. Western Atlantic. Same area as last month." Margaret stands up. She walks to the map on the wall behind her desk. The map is covered with red pins. Each pin represents a U-boat sighting. Each pin is marked with a date and a position report. She finds the cluster of pins in the Western Atlantic. 5 pins in the last 6 months. The same general area. The same pattern. Margaret says, "Show me the exact coordinates, and show me the other Emmermann intercepts. I want to see them all together." David gives her the new intercept. Margaret places it on her desk next to 5 older intercepts. She looks at the coordinates. She has been studying intercepts for 18 months. She knows the difference between random data and pattern. This is pattern. This is absolutely pattern. Margaret says, "Move the pins into a line. Connect them chronologically." David moves 5 red pins on the map. He starts with the oldest intercept from 4 months ago. The next pin is from 8 weeks ago, then 6 weeks ago, then 3 weeks ago, then today. As he places the pins, a shape begins to emerge. The pins form a line, but not a straight line. They curve, they move in a rhythm. Northwest, then south, then a pause, then northwest again. The pins show the hunting route of a predator. Margaret leans over the map. Her eyes move along the line of pins. She is silent. She is thinking. Her brother Thomas runs a convoy route in this exact area next week. She does not tell David this. She does not tell anyone this. She simply looks at the pattern and understands what it means. Margaret says, "We need James Morrison. Get him. Now." 20 minutes later, James Morrison is standing in the office, rubbing sleep from his eyes. James is a mathematician from Yale. He teaches mathematics the way other men breathe. He has been recruited by the military to analyze code-breaking patterns. He is told very little about the war. He is told only that there are patterns and he needs to find them. Margaret shows James the map with the 5 pins. She explains about Emmerman. She explains about the position reports. She explains about the coordinates forming a line and the line forming a curve. James says, "You are telling me that a German submarine follows the same patrol route repeatedly." Margaret says, "I am telling you that Ernst Emmerman has reported his position 5 times in the last 4 months, and each position report follows a predictable pattern. The pattern repeats every 3 weeks approximately. The position correlates with lunar cycles and weather patterns and areas where merchant convoys are most likely to travel." James walks to the map and studies it. He does what mathematicians do. He stops looking at the individual points and starts looking at the relationships between them. He starts thinking about probability. He starts thinking about why a submarine commander would choose this route and when and how often. James says, if this pattern is real, if other commanders follow similar patterns, if we can analyze the data from all U-boat intercepts, not just Emmerman, then we could build a system to predict where attacks will happen. Margaret says, before they happen. We could predict where attacks will happen before they happen. James looks at her. He understands what she is really saying. She is saying they could save ships. She is saying they could save lives. She is saying her brother's convoy could avoid the hunting grounds. James says, we would need much more data. We would need position reports from dozens of U-boat commanders. We would need weather data and lunar cycles and timing information. We would need to understand not just where they are, but why they are there. Margaret says, then we get it. We build a model. We test it against the historical data. We prove it works. James says, if this works, if we can actually predict U-boat movements, we would need to bring this to Admiral King. This would change everything about how we run convoys. Margaret says, if this works, yes, if this works, we could change the entire Atlantic War. Over the next 4 weeks, Margaret and James work with only 2 other analysts, a cryptographer named Sarah Williams and a statistician named David Chen, who is Margaret's younger brother. They work 16-hour days collecting data from every single U-boat intercept in the last 6 months. They build charts and maps and probability tables. They feed data through mechanical calculators until 2 a.m. each night. They test their model against historical intercepts. They adjust the model when it does not work. They refine the model when it shows promise. On October 31st at 4 p.m., James walks into Colonel Williams's office. Colonel Williams is Margaret's supervisor, and he is not a man who believes in theory. He believes in facts that can be verified. James lays out the data on Colonel Williams's desk. Maps with colored lines showing patrol patterns. Charts showing the correlation between position reports and lunar cycles. A probability table showing that their model had 91% accuracy when tested against known U-boat positions from the previous month. James says, Colonel, we have found something significant. The U-boats operate on repeating patrol schedules. The schedules correlate with weather and moon phases and areas of high merchant traffic. We can predict with 91% probability where each boat will be at any given time. Colonel Williams says, your model assumes the Germans do not change their tactics. What if they know we are intercepting them? James says, Sir, based on all current intelligence, the German Navy believes their codes are unbreakable. They see no reason to change successful tactics. The submarine commanders will continue using these patrol routes because the routes work. They deliver supplies. They position boats for attacks on our convoys. From a tactical perspective, the patterns will remain the same. Colonel Williams sits back in his chair. He understands what Morrison is saying. He understands that if this works, it could save hundreds of lives. He also understands that if this fails, it could cost hundreds of lives. Colonel Williams says, "I want you to present this directly to Admiral King, you and Chen. I want the Admiral to see this data with his own eyes." 3 days later, Margaret and James stand in front of Admiral Ernest King in a secure conference room in Washington, D.C. Admiral King is 60 years old and has spent his entire career in the Navy. He is briefed on classified information every single day. But this is different. This is two civilians suggesting they can predict the future. Margaret presents the data. She shows the maps. She shows the probability tables. She explains the correlation between U-boat patrol patterns and weather and lunar phases. She explains how the model adjusts as new intercepts come in. Admiral King listens without interrupting. When Margaret finishes, he says, "If we route convoys based on your predictions, and we are wrong, if your model makes a mistake and those ships encounter submarines, what happens then?" Margaret says, "Then ships will be lost, sir, but ships are being lost now. Right now. Without this model, we are routing convoys blind. We are hoping. We are guessing. 91% accuracy is better than hope. It is better than guessing." James says, "Admiral, the model is not a guarantee. It is a probability. But every convoy we protect is a convoy that arrives. Every convoy that arrives is supplies that reach Britain. Every supply ship that reaches Britain is one less reason for the war to continue, one less reason for men to die." Admiral King says, "How long would it take to expand this to cover all U-boat operations in the Atlantic?" Margaret says, 6 weeks, sir, with a full team, with unlimited resources." Admiral King says, "You have 6 weeks. You have a full team. You have unlimited resources. Morrison, you are now a civilian technical advisor to the Navy. Chen, you are his deputy. You report to me directly. And you do not speak about this to anyone, not to your families, not to your friends. You understand?" Margaret and James both say, "Yes, Admiral." Admiral King says, "Then we begin, and God help us if this works." On November 14th, the first convoy routed entirely by the prediction model departs from New York. It is convoy HX 217, 42 merchant ships carrying supplies to Britain. Based on the model, Margaret and James predict 4 U-boats will be in the convoy's direct path within the next 6 days. They route the convoy 200 nautical miles north of the predicted attack zone. The convoy escorts are not told why they have received new orders. They are simply ordered to maintain the new course. For 6 days, the convoy travels north through rough seas. The weather is cold. The men are tired. But the ship's radio remains silent. No contact with enemy vessels. No attacks. No deaths. On the 7th day, a radio message reaches the Navy Department. Convoy HX 217 has arrived safely in Liverpool. All 42 ships, all crew members, 0 casualties. Margaret is standing alone in the war room late that night when she reads the message. She sits down in front of the wall map. She looks at the colored pins that represent U-boat positions. She looks at the red line she drew, showing the predicted attack zone. The convoy had traveled north around the zone. The convoy had survived. She thinks about her brother Thomas. She thinks about his convoy that will sail next week. She thinks about the 42 ships that are now safely in Liverpool. She thinks about the men on those ships, real men with real families, real lives that continue because a system worked exactly as designed. But she also thinks about something else. She thinks about systems, about what happens when a system becomes too powerful, about what happens when people begin to rely on a system instead of making decisions themselves. She thinks about what Ernst Emmermann would do if he realized that his position reports were not secret, if he understood that every move he made was being predicted, if he decided to use that knowledge against the system instead of with it. Margaret does not share these thoughts with anyone. She simply looks at the red pins on the map and understands that she has created something that is far more dangerous than she initially believed. November 5, 1942. James Morrison has not slept in 36 hours. His hands are shaking slightly from too much coffee and too little food. His office is not really an office. It is a corner of a converted warehouse in Arlington that smells like machine oil and cigarette smoke. Around him, 3 mechanical calculators work continuously. Young men in military uniforms feed data cards into the machines. The machines whir and click and produce long strips of printed numbers. Each number is a calculation. Each calculation is a probability. 36 hours ago, Admiral King gave James an unlimited budget and unlimited resources. James is learning that unlimited resources means something different when the war is happening. It means people work constantly. It means precision matters because a single mistake might cost 1,000 lives. James stares at the wall in front of him. On the wall is a massive map of the Atlantic Ocean. On the map are 243 red pins. Each pin represents a U-boat sighting from the last 6 months. Each pin has a code name next to it. U553 Emmerman, U632 Weber, U571 Hoffman, U412 Kunkel. 243 positions, 243 U-boats, 243 pieces of data showing the hunting patterns of Nazi Germany's submarine force. Margaret Chen enters the office carrying a folder. Inside the folder are the complete intercepts from every U-boat transmission for the month of October. 417 intercepts. Margaret has personally analyzed each one. Her handwriting covers the margins of the pages, notes, questions, observations. She has been awake longer than James. Her eyes show it. Margaret says, "I found another one. U442, Commander Kunkel, same pattern as Emmerman, 3-week cycle, same geographic corridor, Western Atlantic between 43 and 52 degrees north latitude." James takes the folder. He walks to the map and places a new set of pins on the Atlantic. He starts with the oldest U442 sighting from July, the next one from August, September, October. 5 intercepts spread across 4 months. James looks at the spacing, the regularity, the precision. Then he looks at Emmerman's pins next to Kunkel's pins. They are in different hunting zones, but they follow the same rhythmic pattern. James says they are learning from each other, or they are receiving the same orders, the same operational doctrine. Pattern repeats because doctrine repeats. Margaret says, "I think they are receiving specific orders from U-Boat Command in Berlin. Orders about which corridors to patrol. Orders about reporting frequencies. Orders about how often to surface. All of it creates this rhythm, and if they are all following the same orders, then they should all show the same patterns." James says, if that is true, if we can break one commander's pattern, we can predict where they all are going to be. Margaret says, "I have gone through 53 intercepts from 12 different U-boat commanders. They all show it. The same 3-week cycle, the same geographic logic, every single one." James walks back to his desk and pulls out a leather notebook. Inside are mathematical formulas he has been developing since Admiral King gave him the assignment. Formulas for probability, formulas for prediction, formulas that take random data and convert it into something ordered, something predictable, something that can be used as a weapon. James says we need to build a master model, not just for individual commanders, but for all of them simultaneously. We need to feed all the intercept data into a system that can analyze every single U-boat and produce predictions for every single patrol route. We need predictions that work not for one convoy, but for every convoy. Margaret says, "How long would that take?" James says, "At the current pace with the calculators we have, 8 weeks, maybe 9. Margaret says, "We do not have 8 weeks. The Navy wants operationalized predictions within 2 weeks. We need to have a system that works in the war room. We need something Admiral King can actually use to route convoys." James stands up. He walks to the window. Outside the window is Arlington. Trees beginning to turn brown with autumn. People driving to work. America going about its business while somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, submarines are hunting. Somewhere right now, a convoy is sailing blind into waters where death waits below the surface. James says, then we need to simplify the model. We do not need it to be perfect. We need it to be fast. We need it to be usable. We sacrifice precision for speed. Margaret says, we sacrifice accuracy for speed, and convoys start getting sunk again. James says, or we do nothing, and convoys keep getting sunk anyway. Margaret understands. She understands the mathematics of death. She understands that no model is perfect, but an imperfect model is better than no model at all. She understands that in war, there is no such thing as a perfect solution. There are only better choices and worse choices. And sometimes the difference between those choices is whether hundreds of men live or die. Margaret says, I will build the simplified model. You take the full model and test it against historical data. I want 90% accuracy minimum. James says that is not realistic. 90% accuracy requires the Germans to follow patterns with absolute precision. They do not. They deviate. They make mistakes. They have bad luck. Margaret says, then 90% is the target. We come as close as we can, and we do it in 2 weeks. For the next 14 days, James and Margaret work in shifts. Margaret works from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. James works from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. They overlap for 2 hours in the morning to review data and adjust the model. Neither of them goes home. Neither of them sees their families. They exist only within the context of the model, the data, the numbers, the probability calculations that might save lives or might be worthless. On the 8th day, David Chen brings news. David is Margaret's younger brother. He works in the decryption division. He sits across from James at the mechanical calculator. David says, we intercepted something unusual. The Germans are changing their reporting frequency. 2 U-boats that normally report every 6 days have started reporting every 2 days. They are being more active. They are sending more data. James stops moving. He looks at David carefully. Changed reporting frequency means changed behavior. Changed behavior means the model might not work. James says, which commanders? David says, U-553, Emmerman, and U-632, Weber. James says, the ones we have the most data on, the ones that anchor our entire model. David says, yes. James says, did you tell Margaret yet? David says, no. I came to you first. James considers this. He considers what it means. The 2 commanders that have provided the most reliable pattern data suddenly begin behaving differently. It could mean nothing. It could mean the Germans are simply being more aggressive. It could mean something else entirely. James says, do not tell Margaret yet. Let me think about this. James works through the night alone with the data. He looks at Emmerman's new intercepts. He looks at Weber's new intercepts. He feeds the new data into his calculations. He recalculates the patrol routes. He recalculates the probability zones. And something unexpected happens. When he includes the new intercepts, the overall accuracy of the model drops from 91% to 86%. The change is small, but significant. The change means the model is becoming less accurate. The change means something is different. At 5 a.m., James walks to Margaret's desk and wakes her. She has been sleeping for 40 minutes. Her head rests on her arms. She opens her eyes with difficulty. James says, we have a problem. They spend the next hour going through the new intercepts together. They look at the changed reporting frequencies. They look at the increased activity. They test the data against the existing model. They watch the accuracy drop. Margaret says, they are going to figure it out. That is what this means. The submarines are going to figure out that we can predict them. James says, or they are just being more aggressive. There could be a dozen explanations. Margaret says, there is only one explanation that matters. We built a system that works by analyzing their behavior. Their behavior is changing. When behavior changes, the system stops working. And when the system stops working, people die. James says, We need more data. We need to understand why they are changing behavior. Is it tactical? Is it random? Is it something else? Margaret says, or we need to accept that this model is going to have limitations, that at some point the Germans will figure out there is a pattern and they will disrupt it. James says, then we do not have a solution. We have a problem that delays itself. Margaret says, yes, that is probably accurate. They sit in silence in the war room, surrounded by the machines and the data and the pins on the map showing the invisible battle happening beneath the Atlantic. Around them, the night workers continue with their calculations. The machines continue their whirring. The lights of the facility continue burning through the darkness. Margaret says, we present the model as is. We tell Admiral King that we have 91% accuracy on the existing data and 86% on new data, and we recommend cautious deployment. We build the system with the ability to adapt as we get more information. We make it flexible. If the patterns change, we change the model. James says, that might not be enough. Margaret says, it is what we have, and it is better than what we had before. Before we were routing convoys blind. Now we are routing them with 86% probability of accuracy. That saves lives, even if it is not perfect. On November 19th, the first predicted convoy route is transmitted to the Atlantic Fleet. It is Convoy SC-107, 61 merchant ships carrying munitions and supplies for the British Army in North Africa. Based on the prediction model, James and Margaret have identified 6 U-boats in the path of the convoy. They recommend routing the convoy south and west around the predicted attack zone. The convoy follows the recommendation. The convoy deviates from its normal course. The convoy travels through waters where the model predicts no U-boats will be for the next 72 hours. For 3 days, the convoy reports no enemy contact. The ships maintain their course. The sailors maintain their watch. The supplies move closer to Britain. Everything appears to be working exactly as the model predicted. On the 4th day, everything stops working. A merchant ship named the SS Eastland is the first to be hit. A German torpedo strikes the starboard side at 14:27 hours. The explosion tears open the hull. The ship begins to sink. 97 merchant sailors die in the next 8 minutes. The ship goes down carrying supplies that never reach Britain. The ship goes down carrying men who had wives and children and lives waiting for them in American ports. Then another merchant ship is hit. Then a third. Then a fourth. 4 ships sunk in 21 minutes. The U-boats are in the predicted empty zone. The U-boats are exactly where the model said they should not be. Admiral King reads the casualty reports at his office in Washington. He reads that the model has failed. He reads that the convoy was routed directly into an ambush. He reads that 347 men died because a mathematician and a linguist built a system that was not as good as they thought it was. King picks up his phone and calls James Morrison. James hears the silence on the line first, the absence of sound. Then King's voice comes through. It is steady, controlled, dangerous in its calmness. Admiral King says, 4 ships, 347 dead. You told me your model was 91% accurate. James says, the newer data showed 86%. We reported both numbers. Admiral King says, you told me 91% was achievable. James says, sir, the model was accurate on historical data. Something changed. The U-boats are behaving differently. They are not following the expected patterns. Admiral King says, then your system is useless. If the Germans can change their behavior to defeat your predictions, then you have built a weapon that my enemies can turn against me. The line goes dead. Admiral King hangs up. James stands in the war room holding the phone and understanding something profound. He understands that Margaret was right. He understands that systems are dangerous because they encourage belief. They encourage faith. They encourage commanders to trust numbers instead of trusting men. And when the numbers fail, people die not because of the mistake, but because of the faith placed in something that was always fragile. December 2, 1942, U-Boat Command Headquarters, Berlin, an old gray building on Tirpitz-Ufer Street, overlooking the Landwehr Canal. Inside, Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz sits at a desk reading casualty reports. The reports are written in cold military language, but the meaning is clear. 3 U-boats lost in the Atlantic in the past month. 38 U-boat commanders dead. 182 submarine sailors drowned. Dönitz is 62 years old, and he has been fighting this war for almost 4 years. He believes in discipline. He believes in duty. He believes in winning. But lately he is beginning to wonder if someone is cheating. Heinrich Weber is one of Dönitz's best U-boat commanders. Weber is 31 years old and has sunk more tonnage of Allied shipping than any other commander in the German Navy. Weber commands U-boat 632. Weber has learned to think like a predator. He has learned to understand ocean currents and weather patterns and the rhythms of merchant convoys. He has survived 3 years of combat when most submarine commanders die within their first year. Weber is not a man who makes mistakes. So when Weber's position reports go unanswered for 3 weeks without reason. When Weber surfaces in what he believes is a safe zone and finds American escort ships waiting. When his boat narrowly escapes through a crash dive that damages the hull. Dönitz knows something is wrong. Dönitz summons Weber back to Berlin. Weber arrives on December 4th in a military car that drives through streets damaged by British bombs. The city looks like a skeleton. Buildings are burnt shells. Streets are empty. Berlin in 1942 is a city fighting a war it knows it is losing. But no one says this out loud. No one admits it. Weber is brought directly to Dönitz's office. Dönitz says, "Commander Weber, your latest convoy operations have been unsuccessful. You have had multiple opportunities to attack convoys, and you have not achieved results. Explain this." Weber says, "Sir, I have been in a convoy area off the coast of Newfoundland. I have been tracking merchant vessels. But every time I move to attack the convoys have changed course. It is as if they know where I am going to be, as if they are reading my mind." Dönitz says, "That is impossible. Your codes are unbreakable. We have used the same encryption since 1940. The British have not cracked Enigma. Everyone knows this." Weber says, "With respect, sir, I have been commanding a submarine for 3 years. I have developed an instinct for this work, and my instinct tells me that the Americans know something. They are predicting my movements. It is the only explanation." Dönitz stands up from his desk. He walks to the window and looks out at the ruined city below. He thinks about the 3 U-boats lost this month. He thinks about the pattern of failed attacks. He thinks about commanders like Weber who have never made excuses before. Dönitz says, "If what you are saying is true, if the Americans have found a way to predict U-boat movements, then we have a catastrophic security problem. We have to assume our communications are compromised." Weber says, "I am not saying our communications are compromised, sir. I am saying our behavior is predictable. We operate on patrol schedules. We report our positions at regular intervals. We use the same tactics. We follow the same patterns. If someone is intelligent enough to study our patterns, they can predict where we will be." Dönitz turns back from the window. He looks at Weber for a long moment. Then he says something that will change everything. Dönitz says, "Then we must change our patterns, not the codes, not the communications, the behavior. We stop being predictable. We become something that cannot be anticipated." For the next 6 weeks, Dönitz implements a new strategy. He orders U-boat commanders to vary their patrol routes. He orders them to change reporting frequencies randomly. He orders them to deviate from established tactical patterns. He orders them to behave unpredictably. The orders are revolutionary in the German military, where everything is supposed to follow doctrine and discipline. But Dönitz understands something that most military leaders do not understand. He understands that the best defense against prediction is chaos. One of the commanders who receives the new orders is Ernst Emmermann. Emmermann reads the orders from Dönitz and understands what they mean. The Americans have a system for predicting U-boat movements. Dönitz has realized this. And now Emmermann must stop being a creature of habit and become something else entirely. Emmermann has commanded U-boat 553 for 2 years. He has followed the same patrol routes. He has reported from the same positions. He has been successful because he has been predictable. But now he must be unpredictable. Now he must become a shadow. Now he must use the Americans' own need for certainty against them. On January 15, 1943, Emmermann receives a new order from Berlin. It is brief. It is written in code, but Emmermann decodes it easily. The order says only one thing: begin false position reports. Transmit coordinates that are not your real location. Transmit multiple position reports per day instead of one. Flood the Americans with information that is accurate but misleading. Overwhelm their system with data. Emmermann looks at the order and smiles. He understands. This is not a continuation of the old strategy. This is a complete inversion of it. Instead of trying to avoid being detected, Emmermann must actively participate in his own detection. He must send information that will be intercepted and decoded. Information that will confuse rather than clarify. Information that will poison the well. Emmermann begins transmitting. He sends a position report placing his U-boat 300 nautical miles north of his actual location. Then he sends another report 2 hours later, placing himself 100 nautical miles south. Then another report placing himself exactly where he actually is. Then another placing himself west. The messages are contradictory. The messages are impossible to reconcile. But they are all being sent from a U-boat commander that the Americans have been studying for months. They are all appearing on the American maps and in the American charts and in the American prediction model. Margaret Chen is in the war room at Arlington when the intercepts start coming in. David Chen brings her the new position reports from Emmermann. Margaret looks at the coordinates. Her face goes pale. Margaret says, "This is impossible. He is in 5 different places at the same time. These coordinates do not make geographic sense." David says, "He keeps sending more. Every 2 hours a new position report. Every one is contradictory to the last one." Margaret walks to the map on the wall. She tries to plot the new positions. The coordinates form a pattern that is not a pattern. They form a shape that is not a shape. They form something that breaks the logic of geography. Margaret says, "Someone knows about the model. Someone in Germany knows we are using U-boat position reports to predict attacks, and they are deliberately sending false information to break it." James Morrison hears this from across the war room. He comes over immediately. James looks at the coordinates. James looks at the map. James understands exactly what is happening. James says, "They are using the system against us. They have figured out what we are doing, and now they are weaponizing it. They are poisoning the well with information." Margaret says, "If Emmermann is sending false position reports, that means every other commander might be doing the same thing. All the data we have collected, all the patterns we have analyzed, all of it could be compromised. The model is not working anymore. The model is being used against us." James sits down. He puts his head in his hands. He understands something that Margaret has not quite articulated yet. The Americans built a system to predict German movements. The system worked. The system saved lives. But the system revealed itself. By working, the system exposed itself. And now the Germans have turned the system into a weapon against its creators. Admiral King arrives at the war room 2 hours later. He has been briefed on the situation. King is angrier than he was when the SS Eastland went down. Because this is different. This is not a failure of the system. This is the system being deliberately corrupted from outside. King says, "Is the model salvageable? Can you adjust for false data?" James says, "We could theoretically filter false reports. But we would need to know which reports are false and which are accurate. We cannot do that. We have no way to verify the truth of any position report. King says, then the system is dead. The Americans built a machine to predict the enemy, and the enemy has turned it into a tool of deception. Margaret says they must have an informant, someone in our operation, someone who told the Germans what we were doing. King says, that does not matter right now. What matters is that we have a system that we can no longer trust. And if we cannot trust the system, then we have nothing. King walks to the map and looks at the impossible coordinates. He looks at the network of false position reports. He looks at a battle being fought not between ships and submarines, but between prediction models and deliberate deception. King says, shut it down. Take the model offline. Stop routing convoys based on U-boat predictions. Tell the fleet to use evasive routing based on weather and intuition. We go back to the way things were before. We go back to hoping and guessing. James says, sir, if we shut down the system, convoys will start being sunk again. The losses will increase dramatically. King says, the losses have already increased. We are being hunted by information now. We are being killed by data. At least with intuition, we are not deceiving ourselves. But Margaret is not listening to this conversation. Margaret is looking at the map. She is looking at the false coordinates. She is thinking about something that the others have not realized yet. The Germans have revealed their strategy. The Germans are now dependent on sending false information to confuse the American system. But that means Emmerman and the other commanders must continue sending reports. They cannot go silent because silence would be more suspicious than false information. They must continue the deception or the deception fails. Margaret says, wait, do not shut down the system. King turns to Margaret. Margaret says, they are trapped by their own strategy. They must keep sending false reports to maintain the deception, which means we can use the false reports against them. We can invert the model. Instead of looking for where the U-boats say they are, we look for where they definitely are not. We look for the gaps in the false coordinates. We look for the logic behind the illogic. James understands immediately. He stands up from his desk. James says, the false coordinates follow a pattern. They are deliberately scattered, but they are scattered in a way that creates zones. If we invert the model, if we look for the areas that are never mentioned, the areas that the U-boats are avoiding, those are the areas where the U-boats actually are. King says, you are asking me to use a broken system to predict German movements. Margaret says, I am asking you to understand that the Germans have just made a crucial mistake. They have turned a predictive system into a self-revealing system. The false information itself becomes information. The lies become data. And if we know how to read lies, then we can turn their deception into our victory. January 22, 1943. The war room has been transformed into a war itself. The walls are covered with maps showing false U-boat positions. The false coordinates form patterns that look like static. They look like noise. They look like the ocean has become unpredictable. Margaret stands in the center of the room with a red pencil in her hand. She is drawing lines connecting the false positions. She is looking for the invisible pattern inside the visible chaos. James Morrison stands beside her watching her work. He has not slept in 11 days. His eyes have taken on a quality that James does not recognize in himself. They are the eyes of a man who is thinking so hard that he is no longer entirely present in his body. James understands what Margaret is doing. She is not looking for where the U-boats are. She is looking for where they are lying about being. She is looking for the absence of information as if absence itself can be information. James says, the false coordinates have a symmetry. Look at them. They expand outward from a central zone. That central zone is where the real activity is. Margaret says, that is what Donitz intended. He created a model of deception based on creating a shell of noise around a core of real movements. He wants us to see the chaos and conclude that nothing is predictable. James says, but chaos itself follows rules. The chaos is structured. The deception is mathematical. That means it has weakness. Margaret draws a circle on the map. She draws it not where Emmerman claims to be. She draws it around the places where Emmerman is not claiming to be. She draws a circle that encompasses 200 nautical miles of Atlantic Ocean. Inside that circle, she marks 3 points where Emmerman's actual movements must be if the false data is to be consistent with tactical reality. Margaret says, if Emmerman is flooding us with data that is deliberately contradictory, he is betting that we will see only the contradiction. But there is a contradiction to the contradiction. There is a pattern to the chaos. The pattern is the absence of false data in certain zones. Those are the zones where the pattern is actually happening. David Chen is monitoring new intercepts. He brings Margaret a fresh set of coordinates. David's hand is shaking slightly when he hands her the paper. David has been working 18-hour days for the past month. David is beginning to understand something that Margaret and James already know. The information being created in this war room is not academic. It is not theoretical. It is the difference between life and death on the Atlantic Ocean. David says, 3 new intercepts from Emmerman, 3 new false positions. All of them follow the predicted pattern you outlined. Margaret looks at the coordinates. She plots them on the map. They form a shape. The shape is the shadow of the real U-boat beneath the noise of false transmissions. Margaret is looking at the ghost of Ernst Emmerman, and the ghost is telling her exactly where he is. Admiral King enters the war room at 4 p.m. He has been in meetings with the Joint Chiefs of Staff all morning. He looks exhausted. He looks like a man who has been forced to explain something impossible to people who do not want to hear it. King says, the fleet is asking for more information. They want to know the accuracy of the new predictions. They want to know if we are going to route convoys based on inverted false data, or if we are guessing. James says, we have tested the inverted model against historical data. The accuracy is 89%. King says, 89%. That means 1 out of every 11 convoys following your recommendations will encounter U-boats. Margaret says, 1 out of every 11 convoys will encounter U-boats. But they will be prepared. They will be aware. They will not be ambushed by an invisible enemy. Before our system existed, those convoys would have been destroyed without anyone knowing why. Now they know why. And that is the difference between disaster and managed risk. King sits down at the table. He looks at the maps. He looks at the false coordinates and the inverted predictions. He looks at a battle being fought not with guns, but with information. King understands that he has to choose. He has to choose between using a system that is 89% accurate and using no system at all. He has to choose between knowing and guessing. King says, route convoy TC-118 according to the inverted model. Full naval escort, highest alert status. If the model fails on this convoy, I will shut the entire operation down and court-martial everyone in this room. You understand? Margaret says, we understand, sir. King says, and if the model succeeds, if convoy TC-118 arrives safely because we used false information to find the truth, then we have created something that the Germans cannot counter, something that uses their own deception against them. The convoy departs on January 27th. 53 merchant ships, 12 escort vessels, over 1,000 men at sea following a prediction based on inverted false data, following a system that says the truth is hidden inside the lie, following a system that says the enemy has already revealed himself by trying to hide. For 6 days, the convoy travels through the Atlantic in winter conditions. The weather is cold, the seas are rough, the men are afraid. But nothing happens. No U-boats appear. No torpedoes come out of the darkness. The convoy passes through the zone where the model predicted Emmerman would not be, and the model is correct. Emmerman is not there. On the 7th day, a German U-boat surfaces 200 nautical miles north of the predicted zone. It is U-boat 632. It is Heinrich Weber's boat. Weber has not received the orders to use false coordinates. Weber does not know that Dönitz has deliberately poisoned the communication system with deception. Weber is operating under the old system, the old predictable system. And the American convoy is in the exact zone where the old system predicted no American ships would be. But convoy TC-118 is not where it was supposed to be, according to the old system. Convoy TC-118 is where the new system predicted it would be. And the new system predicted it would be nowhere near Weber's U-boat. So Weber surfaces and finds empty ocean. Weber waits for hours. Weber checks his coordinates. Weber sends position reports to Berlin. Weber understands that something has changed. Something has fundamentally changed. Weber dives. He moves to the predicted zone. But by the time Weber reaches the zone, convoy TC-118 has already passed through it. The convoy is now in waters where Weber cannot possibly be because the American system has predicted where he will go and positioned the convoy to avoid that location. On the 8th day, convoy TC-118 arrives in Liverpool. All 53 merchant ships, all 1,000 men, 0 casualties, 0 U-boats. The first American convoy routed entirely by inverted false data. The first American convoy that survived not despite the enemy's deception, but because of it. The first convoy to win the war by making the enemy's lies into a tool of truth. Admiral King reads the cable in his office at 6 a.m. He reads it twice to make sure he is not hallucinating. Then he reads it a third time. Convoy TC-118 safe. All ships, all personnel. U-boat Weber attempted intercept and failed. The inverted model worked. The system that predicted the future by understanding the lie worked perfectly. King picks up his phone and calls Margaret Chen. Margaret answers on the second ring. She has not been sleeping. She has been in the war room waiting for the cable. She has been waiting to learn if her inversion of the system actually works, or if she has just wasted Admiral King's time and risked the lives of 1,000 sailors. King says convoy TC-118 arrived safely. All ships, you did it. You actually did it. You used the enemy's deception against them. Margaret says, no, sir, the Germans did it. They created a system of deception. We simply learned how to read it. We learned that chaos has structure. We learned that the absence of information is information. We learned that lies speak truth if you know how to listen. King says, this changes everything. This changes the war. If we can invert the false data from all U-boat commanders. If we can apply this method across the entire Atlantic, the U-boat threat is finished. The convoy war is won. But Margaret is not celebrating. Margaret understands something that Admiral King has not fully grasped yet. She understands that Dönitz will eventually realize what has happened. Dönitz will realize that his deception has been inverted. And when Dönitz realizes this, he will change his strategy again. The chess match will continue. The war between systems will escalate. Margaret says, the inverted model will work for a time, sir. But Dönitz is intelligent. He will realize that we are using his deception against him. And when he realizes this, he will create a new form of deception. He will create chaos within chaos. He will layer deception upon deception until we cannot distinguish lie from truth. King says, then we will invert the new system when we discover it. Margaret says, perhaps, sir. Or perhaps we will discover that we have created a system so dependent on deception that it cannot function without it. And when the deception ends, we will be blind again. But King is no longer listening to Margaret's warnings. King is thinking about victory. King is thinking about the convoy war being won. King is thinking about the Americans having turned the weapon of false information into a tool of American power. King is thinking about the future of warfare being fought not on the ocean, but in the invisible realm of information. Margaret hangs up the phone. She walks back to the map in the war room. She looks at the circles she has drawn. She looks at the false coordinates that have become true coordinates. She looks at a system that has consumed German deception and produced American victory. And she understands that she has done something that cannot be undone. She has proven that the future of warfare is not about ships or guns or submarines. The future of warfare is about information. The future of warfare is about believing the right lie. Margaret thinks about her brother Thomas. She thinks about how many convoys he will now safely command. She thinks about the families that will get their sons back. She thinks about all the lives that have been saved because a system was built and then inverted. And she understands that the cost of this victory is not measured in sailors' lives. The cost is measured in the power of systems to determine the outcome of human existence. The system won. The system won because it learned to embrace the chaos instead of fighting it. And that is the most dangerous victory of all. May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered. The flags are flying over the bunker in Berlin, but Gross Admiral Dönitz will not be there to see them. Dönitz is being held in a military prison in London. He is waiting for his trial. He is waiting to account for the decisions he made. One of those decisions was to poison the communication system with deliberate deception. One of those decisions changed the course of the Atlantic War. Ernst Emmermann has survived the war. U-Boat 553 sank one ship in its entire operational history, one merchant vessel carrying rubber and medical supplies. Emmermann sank that ship and then disappeared into the Atlantic depths where no American convoy ever found him again. Emmermann is dead now. He died in May 1943 when his U-boat was depth-charged by an American escort in waters where the inverted prediction model said he would never be. The model was 89% accurate. Emmermann was the 11%. Heinrich Weber survived the war. Weber's U-boat was scuttled in May 1945 as Germany surrendered. Weber escaped the sinking boat and was captured by American forces on a Danish beach. Weber is now in a prisoner of war camp in Maine. Weber thinks about the Atlantic every day. Weber thinks about the model that was designed to predict him and then was inverted to defeat him. Weber thinks about the American woman he never met, named Margaret Chen, who understood something about the nature of deception that Weber himself did not understand. Margaret Chen is standing in a building in Arlington, Virginia, looking at a wall. The wall is covered with maps. The maps show U-boat positions from the entire Atlantic War. The maps show predicted zones and actual zones. The maps show the victories achieved through information warfare. But Margaret is not celebrating. Margaret is looking at a number on a paper in front of her. The number is 4 million tons of Allied shipping sunk. The number is 65,000 Allied sailors dead. The number is the cost of the Atlantic War. The number is the price that was paid while the system was being built and refined and finally inverted. James Morrison has returned to Yale. He is teaching mathematics again. But the mathematics James teaches now includes a chapter on systems, a chapter on how systems can be weaponized, a chapter on how the most powerful tool can be created and then turned against its creator. James understands something that most people do not understand. The victory over the U-boats was a victory, but it was also something else. It was the beginning of a new kind of war, a war that would be fought not on oceans, but in the invisible realm of information and systems and prediction. Admiral King is no longer working in the war room. King is now a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. King is making decisions about the future of warfare. King is thinking about the system that was built to predict U-boats and wondering if it can be adapted for other purposes. King is wondering if the future of warfare belongs not to ships and guns, but to computers and prediction models. King understands that something fundamental has changed. The rules of warfare have been written in numbers instead of steel. Margaret Chen does not go home on May 8th when the war in Europe officially ends. Margaret works through the night in the war room. Margaret is finishing a report. The report is marked Top Secret. The report explains how the system was built. The report explains how the system failed. The report explains how the system was inverted. The report explains how an entire war was won by learning that truth can hide inside a lie and that the enemy's own deception can be turned into the victor's most powerful weapon. David Chen comes into the war room at 4 a.m. David is exhausted. David has been working continuously for the past 4 years. David has aged 10 years in those 4 years. David brings Margaret coffee. David says, "You should sleep. The war is over. You have done what you were asked to do." Margaret says, "The war is not over. The war has just begun. This war will not be fought by soldiers. This war will be fought by systems. And we have just proven that systems can defeat other systems. That information can be weaponized. That prediction can become a weapon more powerful than any gun." David says, "Then what are you going to do?" Margaret says, "I am going to write down what we learned. I am going to document how we built the system. I am going to explain the principles that made it work. And then I am going to warn people about what comes next." David says, "What comes next?" Margaret says, "What comes next is that every nation will want this system. Every nation will want to predict the enemy before the enemy moves. Every nation will build systems to counter other systems. And the war will not be on the ocean or in the sky. The war will be inside the machines. The war will be inside the numbers. And humans will no longer control the war. The systems will control humans." Margaret finishes writing at dawn. She signs the report and seals it in an envelope marked, "For the President." Margaret knows this report will change things. Margaret knows that the system that was built to win the Atlantic War will be used for other purposes. Margaret knows that she has helped create something that cannot be uncreated. She has helped prove that information warfare is possible. She has helped demonstrate that prediction models can decide the fate of nations. On the evening of May 8th, Margaret walks to the parking lot at Arlington. It is dark. It is quiet. The war is over, but Arlington looks the same as it did before the war. The same buildings, the same roads, the same sense of work being done in secret. Margaret gets in her car and drives home. She drives through streets that are celebrating the victory. She drives past people who are happy that the war is over. But Margaret knows that for her, the war is not over. The war for Margaret has just transformed from one kind of war into another kind of war. A war that will be fought with information instead of weapons. A war where the enemy is not known, but the system is trusted. A war where victory will be measured not in ships saved, but in the power of systems to determine human fate. Margaret thinks about Thomas. Thomas is home now. Thomas survived the Atlantic. Thomas survived the convoys that were routed using the inverted prediction model. Thomas is alive because Margaret built a system. Thomas is alive because Margaret understood something about deception. Thomas is alive because a woman in Arlington learned to read lies. But Margaret understands something that Thomas does not understand. Thomas is alive not because Margaret saved him. Thomas is alive because a system decided that Thomas's convoy would be routed in a certain direction. And if the system had predicted differently, Thomas would be dead. Margaret has not saved lives. Margaret has transferred control of life and death from humans to systems. And that is a victory that tastes like ash. Margaret stops her car at a bridge overlooking the Potomac River. She gets out of the car and stands at the railing. She looks at the water below. She thinks about all the sailors who died in the Atlantic Ocean. She thinks about the 65,000 who did not come home. She thinks about the 4 million tons of ships that went down. She thinks about Emmerman, who died because the system predicted he would live. She thinks about Weber, who lived because the system failed to predict him accurately. Margaret understands that she has built something that transcends right and wrong. She has built a system that is neither good nor evil. The system is simply true. The system works. And a system that works is more powerful than a system that is just. A system that works is more dangerous than any weapon. A system that works will be used for things that Margaret never intended. A system that works will eventually destroy its creators. Margaret gets back in her car and drives home. Behind her, the war room in Arlington continues to work. The machines continue to calculate. The data continues to flow. The system continues to grow. And inside that system, the future of warfare has already been written. The future is not bright. The future is not dark. The future is mathematical. The future is systematic. The future is determined by machines that humans created but can no longer fully control. Margaret thinks about what she will tell people when they ask her what she did in the war. Margaret thinks about how to explain building a system that saved lives by calculating risk. Margaret thinks about how to explain creating something that transcends human understanding. Margaret thinks about how to explain being the architect of the future. On the morning of May 9th, the newspapers announced that the war in Europe is over. Margaret reads the headlines. The headlines talk about victory. The headlines talk about the bravery of soldiers. The headlines talk about the end of tyranny. But the headlines do not mention the system. The headlines do not mention Margaret Chen or James Morrison. The headlines do not mention the room in Arlington where information was weaponized. The headlines do not mention that the true victory of World War II was not the defeat of Germany, but the proof that information could be turned into a tool more powerful than steel. Margaret puts down the newspaper and looks at a photograph on her desk. The photograph shows Thomas in his naval uniform. Thomas smiling. Thomas alive. Margaret picks up the photograph and holds it for a long moment. Then she puts it face down on the desk. Because Margaret understands that Thomas is alive not because of love or sacrifice or courage. Thomas is alive because of mathematics. And in the world that is coming, mathematics will be more important than love. The war is over. But something else has begun. Something that will change warfare forever. Something that will make humans the prisoners of their own systems. Something that Margaret Chen has helped create. Something that cannot be stopped. Something that cannot be changed. Something that is already writing the future in code and numbers and mathematical certainty. The difference between victory and defeat is information. The difference between freedom and control is who owns the system. Subscribe to understand how the wars of tomorrow will be fought not with weapons, but with numbers. Because the future is mathematical, and mathematics doesn't forgive.